Alright, hello. Today I'd like to talk about a topic which I think is important and useful to know for anybody who is seriously interested in politics and political science. If you're anything like me, you dislike culture war issues. You think they're kind of useless to argue about, that they're not really all that important, that the real big questions of politics lie in things like the state, the government, economics, and things like that. If that is your focus like it is mine, you're probably familiar with the basically never-ending discussion between libertarians, anarchist capitalists, liberals, socialists, communists, Marxists, stuff like that. That's the kind of political argument sphere that I like to move around, that I'm interested in. And I think that there is a bit of miscommunication on the part of these constituent groups and ideologies, and I think that the discussion between them can be improved. The way that the important thing here is that all of these ideologies, libertarians, I already named them, you know what I'm talking about, their shared feature, one of them, a big one of them, is that they discuss about property. A big argument of, capitalist versus socialist, or libertarian versus liberal, things like that, is property. This notion of property, of who should own what, how does ownership work, what can be owned, and things like that. So, since this discussion is so focused on the topic of property, wouldn't it be helpful for the discussion if there was some kind of unified theory of property that communists, anarchists, libertarians, liberals, things like that, groups like that, could agree upon and then have a discussion going on from there? So far, I don't think the popular discussion has gotten to the point of having a shared theory of property, but I think it's possible to change that, and I'd like to dedicate this video to offering a theory of property and exploring the implications that it has for this debate. So first of all, is there even a theory of property? Some people might say, some really realist, cynical types might say that property doesn't really exist, that everybody just owns what they can defend at the moment, and that at any moment a stronger person can come along and take it away from you. The problem with this view is that if you believe this, you can't believe that stealing is a thing. If you do not believe that there is some kind of moral theory of property that ascribes certain things to certain people, you can never say that you got robbed. You can never say that somebody stole something. And most importantly, for the discussion of political science, you can't actually be any of the ideologies that I talked about earlier. Socialist, communist, capitalist, libertarian, ANCAP, stuff like that. Because all of those ideologies make claims about who should own what should be owned. They all have the word should in them. If you believe that property it's not a moral thing, it's just whoever, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, then that is a profoundly apolitical view, and I don't think it's actually a view that you hold. So I think, with these things in mind, I think we can at least agree on one thing, and that is that, one, property is a moral claim. It's a moral theory as to claim. It's a moral theory as to who should have what. Without such a theory, you can't say anybody stole anything, because there's no theory as to who should have what. So, I think I've defended pretty well the idea that property is a theory. And I think most people would agree that there is a theory to property. The obvious bigger question here is, what is this theory? More, what is it specifically? How is it worked out? How does it work? Before I get to that, I want to knock down another bad theory of property. So we've knocked down this one that property isn't really real. The other popular belief may be that property just comes from the right of purchase. That is, if somebody, because property is a moral claim, if somebody asks you, what right do you have to this piece of property, you'll answer, well, because I bought it. Right of contract, right of exchange is very important, but it does not legitimize your ownership of the property. The reason it does not do this is because it'll only work if the person who sold the property to you owned it legitimately. What is really happening when you buy or sell something is what you're really selling is you're selling the legitimate right to ownership to that thing. If you do not possess the legitimate ownership to that thing, you can't sell that legitimate ownership. So for example, I steal somebody's car and I sell it to you. Even though you paid money for the car, the original owner of the car could very legitimately and rightfully want the car back from you. And this seems legitimate, moral, this seems to be reasonable, because again, even though you paid for it, you bought it from somebody who didn't have a legitimate claim to it. So if all property is, well, I bought it so it's mine, you have this like infinite regress of a buyer getting the legitimate right from a previous owner, getting the legitimate right from a previous owner, it's just an infinite regress, and it leaves a question as to how the original title to the property was created. How was the property originally legitimized? So these two theories, that property doesn't really exist, or that property is simply whatever you buy, they don't work. They don't work as a moral theory that is useful for political science to have like economics debates and things like that. So I've knocked down two theories that I think are bad. I won't talk about any more. I don't want to waste anybody's time. What I think is time to do now is to offer a positive theory of property. And for this, I think it is very useful to turn to John Locke. If you're at all interested in political science, political theory, I'm sure you know who John Locke is. He's the author of the work, he's author of a lot of works. But the most famous one that everyone talks about is the Second Treatise of Government, in which he gives, in my opinion, a very good account of how property works. So I am going to go through his theory of property, not word for word, and I will be kind of like modernized. I'll be adding to it a little bit. But if you've read his book, The Second Treatise of Government, you will see that I'm not changing the theory in its substance. I'm just kind of changing it around so that it works more in like a modern context and I can explain it better. Okay, so we know that a theory of property exists and that it's some kind of moral claim. It's a claim about who ought to have a thing. The question that might arise immediately is, if it's a moral right to something, how do you get this moral right? If one big contender for this moral right might be the government. Some people might argue that the reason that you're properly the owner of a thing is because the government has acknowledged your right to that thing. The problem with this argument that Locke points out very well in his book is that it seems to us that property precedes any government. That is, it exists before any government exists at all. Let me illustrate with an example. Imagine you're like a caveman or just some person outside of society wandering around in the woods, and you run into a shack. You come upon somebody's shack in the woods, and they're not home. You don't know who owns it. It's just a shack, but you can assume somebody lives there. Even without any government or laws, you will have this intuitive sense that it belongs to somebody, and that if you mess with it, you're going to be messing with them, and that they will likely, be aggressive towards you back. And moreover, if somebody is, aggressive, if, you mess with this shack of this, other caveman, and he hits you over your head with a rock or something, you're not going to be asking yourself, why did he do that? You might disagree with it, you might fight him back, you might even defeat him and kill him and take his shack. But what you're not going to do is you're not going to ask yourself, why is he trying to kill me or hurt me or scare me off? So what I hope to illustrate with this example is that a sense of property, a sense of rightful ownership precedes government, and it even precedes any kind of organized society. So, property, at least right now, does not come from government. But it gets a little bit more complicated later. But right now, we know that some kind of sense of property exists before government. And let's explore what this kind of property is, because we know it exists, but let's look at how it works exactly. In order to start to look into this, go back to this example that I gave of you being, in the woods. You stumble upon this shack, and you need to ask yourself, okay, I had this intuition that this is probably somebody else's and I shouldn't mess with it. Why? Why did you think that this was somebody else's? Well, first off, you can see that the house, the shack, is the product of some kind of labor. It's a physical improvement. Whoever built it had to either forge the wood or cut the wood. They had to build the shack. They had to put labor into it. That is the first kind of rule of John Locke's theory of ownership, is that you own the things that you put your labor into. And this is quite intuitive, I think, because obviously one of the main reasons why you think that this shack belongs to somebody else is because shacks don't grow up out of the ground randomly. They have to be produced by the labor of another. So, okay. So we have a fraction of this theory of labor, is that a moral right to the ownership of an object that precedes the government comes from you putting your labor into an object. Now let's examine a different scenario. Instead of coming up on a shack, you come up on a big village. There's a group of shacks. Would you assume, if you go up to this village of shacks, and you don't really see anybody, but you see the buildings, would your first thought be to, oh boy, I better not mess with the one single caveman that owns all these shacks? It probably wouldn't be. You would assume, without any other information, that this village, this collective of shacks, is owned by a group of people. This is because this theory that your labor gives you ownership of a thing necessarily limits the scope of ownership. Because a single caveman couldn't have made this whole village, you assume that the owners that you're dealing with, who you don't want to mess with, is a group of people. And so, again, this gets us, I'm trying to do like this roundabout way of, because I'm a big fan of going through political arguments clearly, kind of like you're doing a math problem. So this is the reason I'm doing this. And I want to kind of rein it in a little bit to Locke's theory, which I am describing, but I want to put it in his words, kind of. I'm not going to quote him, but I'm going to paraphrase him. Essentially, you own just by natural law, you own the things which you put your labor into, which necessarily limits the scope of property. And Locke also believed you should only own the things which you can make use of, which I think is also a very intuitive claim. Since I've made 2 examples using cavemen, let's make a third. Imagine again, you're a caveman outside of society, no government, no nothing, and you come upon another caveman and he has a single mango. You would feel wrong, or maybe you would feel wrong, but you would understand his desire to defend this one mango. You wouldn't question it. He has one mango, he can eat the mango, that's it. But if you come upon one caveman who has 1,000 mangoes, and you know those mangoes are going to spoil and he cannot eat all of them, you're not really going to understand why he's trying to defend them and stop you from taking them. So, Locke's theory of property, put completely, because I separated it into parts, is that humans have a natural right that precedes the government to the fruits of their labor, and this is limited by the scope of their labor, and it's also limited by the scope of what they can use. If you take something and you let it spoil, Locke argued that you essentially robbed the people who could have had, this object. For example, the mango in my example. So, this is a theory of property that I don't think too many people will have objections to. Socialists and communists would quite like this idea of you keeping your labor, whereas libertarians and anarchist capitalists would quite like this idea that these rights to property exist before the government. They don't come from the government. They exist just simply because people have brains and they think and they reason. These things come to you intuitively. But there is a problem, which you may have noticed. Because this theory is inherently limited, it's limited in scope, it rules out ownership of things like big factories. How can you own a factory if all you have the right to own is your labor, the fruits of your labor, and the things that you can consume yourself? You can't. And I think most people, maybe anarchist primitivists might not have a problem with this, but most people would argue that economy of scale is a desirable thing and that we should have economic enterprises larger than what each individual person can do on their own. And Locke was aware of this, which is why he devised a second theory of property that stands separate from this first theory of property. So there's two theories of property. There's natural. There's natural property, which I just talked about. It's the things that come before the government, that you have a natural right to the things you put your labor into, you have a natural right to the things that you can make use of. But if you're familiar with Locke's theory, you'll know that he's a big supporter of people banding together and giving up some of their individual rights to create a government in which they have, which will allow them to surpass the limits of their individual person. So the way this would work in terms of property would be that recognizing that it's not really beneficial to forego the benefits of economy of scale, the people would give away a part of their natural right to property to the government, which could then bestow legal property onto people. Because we're not talking face to face, I can't really know how well this comes across, how well I've really explained this. Essentially, what I talked about with natural rights, every person has this natural right. These are people. Every person has this natural right. And they, seeing that they're limited by the scope of their natural rights, they collectively cede a part of them to a government, which can then bestow legal property rights to things that natural property would not give you the right to, such as factories, such as larger bodies of land, such as any larger enterprise, anything that is beyond the scope of what you individually produce and beyond the scope of what you can use. In this way, at least Locke would argue, and I would also argue, we see the rise of the modern kind of conception of property. Now I understand there might be some pushback here. This idea that some property comes from the government and some of it does not. There's two different types of property. We usually think of just one type of property. Communists don't think it's very sacred, whereas ANCAPs and libertarians think property is sacred. This misses the nuance that there's actually, at least under this view, which I think this view is very good, there's two different types of property. There's natural property and there's legal property bestowed by the government. But again, you might be hesitant of accepting this claim that there is a second legal type of property. But again, I want you to think about this intuitively. When it comes to natural property, the house that you live in is your natural property. You use it, you occupy it, you clean it, stuff like that. Under all this criterion, it is your natural property, and you can defend it yourself. Obviously, you can't defend it against like 15 armed intruders, but you're present, you can see what's going on with it, you can keep people out, and by your presence being there, people around you know that it is yours. On the other side, can Jeff Bezos single-handedly make his presence known and defend, or at least stake his claim in all of his warehouses on his own? No, he cannot. He requires the state to give him a legal right to his land. He requires state information gathering agencies to, help take note of infractions against his legal property. He requires law enforcement to protect his legal property, and he requires the courts to respect his property and to punish people who don't respect his property. In this way, we can see that your ownership of your house works differently from Jeff Bezos' ownership of his warehouses. We're not at a point of making normative judgments. This doesn't mean necessarily that Jeff Bezos' ownership of his warehouses is not legit. What it does mean is that it works differently. That's all I'm trying to illustrate. That's all that John Locke tries to illustrate, is that some properties are inherently different than others because they come from a different place. Some properties you just have naturally, and the government has nothing to do with it, whereas other properties necessarily need the government to grant them. I can't make this any more clear. I can't make this any more clear. So, assuming that this is the case, what are the implications of this dual property theory, that there's two theories of property? What are the implications of this? There are many, and I think they're very important. Probably the first would be the implication for the discussion around socialism and kind of like welfare type stuff. So there's this thing that happens when socialists and communists, they say that property should be, it shouldn't be private. They want to abolish private property. And then people, like liberals or opponents of socialism and communism, they go, well, you want people to use your toothbrush? Or you want the government to confiscate your house and move in 5 immigrants? And the socialists and the communists, they usually don't know how to answer, which is frustrating. Just from, even if you're not a socialist or a communist, isn't it beneficial for there to be a good discussion between ideologies. But socialists and communists, a lot of them, they don't know how to answer because they're not acutely aware of the separation between natural and legal property. If you know there's this separation, you can argue for the abolition of legal property while keeping natural property. So, your own house or your toothbrush, that's natural property. But big factories, big collective farms, stuff like that, that is legal property. And this distinction is very important in order to have a good faith discussion between communists and non-communists. But nobody knows how to make this distinction, or they don't do it often, so the conversation doesn't go anywhere. It's the same with talks about immigration. There's a support of immigration, and then some snarky conservative goes and says, well, how would you like it if we moved 10 immigrants into your house? A house is different from a government-funded housing project. One is natural right, the other, natural property of the person living in the house. The other one is a government property that, is bestowed legally. Maybe it's owned by a private individual, but it's a different type of thing. So that's one implication of this distinction between natural and legal property. Oh, let me just get rid of this. There is another important consequence or implication of this for libertarians. Libertarianism is not broken by this understanding, but it is somewhat challenged by it. First of all, actually, I shouldn't have deleted what I deleted. I'm going to keep this here. If our understanding of legal property, so factories, larger enterprises, things like that, is that the way they work is that the people give up a part of their natural rights to property to the government, which can then bestow legal ownership onto an individual of this factory, of this larger enterprise. This kind of challenges the libertarian individualist notion, because this property comes from the people. This right to the property comes from the people who give power to the government, who then bestows the legal right onto, the owner of the factory, the owner of the warehouse, stuff like that. So, again, like I said, this doesn't break libertarianism, but it does push back a little bit on this individualist free-for-all notion that some libertarians argue for. Because if your title to this factory comes originally from the collective rights of the people, what does this mean for your responsibility as the owner of this factory? Do you have some kind of responsibility to these people or not? It's a question. Does that give you some kind of responsibility to the bigger society, or can you, just do whatever you want because you own the property? The second implication this has for libertarianism is this role of the government. Obviously, libertarians are distinct from anarchist capitalists. We'll get to them a little bit later. So I know libertarians aren't against the existence of a government at all. However, the question that arises is, how libertarian is libertarianism exactly? Because the government does play a really big role in this title to property. Libertarians, therefore, cutting down the government to bare minimum. The problem that I see in this is that the government's function of preserving property is like 90% of what it does. If you say, we need to cut down the government to just the bare minimum of preserving property, you still have information gathering agencies, you still have courts, you still have armed forces and a police force to enforce these property claims. Which again, that's okay. That's not like a slam dunk on libertarianism. But I don't know if a lot of libertarians would, if this is what they're actually imagining, right? Because libertarianism is not incompatible with a bunch of people being in jail and an active government that uses courts and intelligence agencies and police to hound down people who break these legal property rights. Because again, the legal property rights come from the government. So the government has to enforce them. So, again, not to be a slam dunk on libertarians, but this conception of a very limited, bare-bones government actually ends up being quite an active government. Like, it's still... the government under libertarianism, if I understand it correctly, would be largely indistinguishable from the government today. It might have different voting. It might not be that involved in, like, equality and, like, gender and race stuff, all the culture war stuff. It'll be out of it. But the actual hard power structures of the state will remain intact. And again, that's a question libertarians need to ask themselves. Is that actually what I'm thinking of? Because libertarians seem to be against the government. I'm sorry. The libertarians seem to be largely against the government, while seemingly necessarily having to keep the government largely intact. Okay, that's enough on libertarians. Finally, this one you may have seen coming from a mile away, and that is the problem with the anarchist capitalists. The anarchist capitalists do not believe in a government or a state or anything of this sort. The question then is, if you believe that owning larger scale things like factories is legitimate, and owning things overseas, and owning properties that you've only been to like twice in your life in China, if you think that that is legitimate, where do you derive the moral right to the property from? Because again, we've established that property is a moral theory that establishes your right to some kind of property. Humans all, by the virtue of being humans, we all have natural rights to property. But stuff like factories and overseas properties and things like that, that are beyond the scope of natural property, seemingly require this collective transfer of power to a government to give you the right to this ownership. In other words, you own this property kind of by like popular sovereignty, because the general society consents to the government giving you the right to the property. If there's no government, if there is no state that does this, how do you justify ownership of what would otherwise be legal property? I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't know if there is an answer. Because again, like I said, you can't just say, oh, it's mine because I'm powerful and I've hired bodyguards to protect it. That's not how property works. John Locke himself argued that might does not make right, and that just because you're strong enough to take something doesn't mean it's yours. So that's out of the question. Also, you can't say it's mine because I bought it, because then the question arises, where did the person you bought it from get their legitimate right to the property? That also doesn't do. And you can't gesture towards your natural right to property, because we've demonstrated that natural property is necessarily limited in scope to the things that you yourself can produce and the things that you yourself can consume. So, if you're an anarchist capitalist, how do you justify ownership of larger economic enterprises? I don't know. And I don't ask this question as like a slam dunk on anarchist capitalists. I think it is an important question, however. This entire theory and framework of property is important. Obviously, you could come up with different theories of property, but I think that this dual theory of property being natural and legal, being two separate kinds and working in two different ways, is very good. I think Locke's theory of property is very good, and I think a lot of people would agree that it is very good. And it's not only good because I think it's internally, logically consistent and coherent, but also because, thanks to it, I've managed to evaluate some claims about socialism, communism, I've managed to look at libertarianism, and I've managed to look at anarchist capitalism. If you take nothing away from this video, but one thing, take away the idea that having a unified theory of property would do wonders for the capitalist versus socialist economic debate. If we can agree as to what property really is, then the debate becomes a lot easier. So, I've talked about a lot of things, and I want to end it off. I don't want to go on for too long. I know people have short attention spans and they're busy. I want to recap what I talked about. There is a concrete moral theory behind property. It's not just something that happens that one person owns something, the other person doesn't own something. No, there is a political science and philosophical theory behind property. One such theory is John Locke's theory, which divides property into natural property and legal property. And they are separate. They work through separate mechanisms. The house you live in, the food you eat, the say family-owned business you work at, that is a different kind of property from large factories, large plantations, bodies of water, large swaths of land. They are fundamentally different. So do not conflate them when you are discussing property and politics, wherever you are. If you're on the left or the right, do not conflate them. Be aware of the separation. Finally, if you are a libertarian or an anarchist capitalist, think through your theory of property and try to come up with a way to reconcile the problems I talked about. Libertarians don't have that big of a problem, but anarchist capitalists, I think, do. So if you are an anarchist capitalist, I'm not asking you to stop being one, but I do think that this is something that you should think about. That's about it for today. I hope I talked in a way that made sense, that people could understand. Obviously, if there's something you disagree with or you want to put your input on this, I'm open always to comments and discussion on the topics. If you have watched this long, I want to thank you. I'm trying my best, and I'm new at this, so I hope that you could take something useful from this. And once again, I want to thank you and wish you a nice day. Goodbye.